In 4+ decades of being a pastor, my life and my ministry has been driven by two passions: the local church and global mission. I know for some people, those are tension points, and those are like the opposite, local and global, the church and mission. For me, it's been hand in glove. It's been the same thing. Serving as a local pastor, but focused on and driven toward global mission. Those have worked really as kind of one and the same for me. I remember years ago taking mission courses at Asia Theological Seminary. I can remember debates about the center of global mission. Is it the local church, or is it an outside sort of a para-church mission agency? And I was using the odd one out in those debates at Asia Theological Seminary because I was saying that the local church should be the center of mission. I was in disagreement with my professor. I was in disagreement with really, I think every single student we had. It was usually me on this side and everyone else over here. And those were informative debates. Those were passionate debates. I'm not sure that it was an either or ultimately decision that had to be made. But for me, the local church was the engine and the center point and the catalyst for global mission. Maybe for others, it was the mission agency. But for me, I always saw the local church and global mission as very compatible and working together and flowing out of the other. I want to look at a scripture that underlines that idea of local church and global mission. And it's a scripture where Jesus helps refocus what is the church and why is the church there. He describes, redefines, repositions where the church should be. It's a very familiar scripture. In fact, so familiar that all four Gospels record a version of this story. Some give more details than others. The skeleton of the story is there. Luke has the shortest version. Oddly enough, Mark has a longer version, but they all include this, and they all include the basics, with some adding something and others emphasizing this or that. But I want to look at Mark's version, and we want to read Mark 11, verses 15 through 17. And then I want to look at what does that mean for us as leaders of local churches who are passionate about global mission. How do those two connect in this text? Verse 15, and they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. So Jesus is entering a temple, and then he speaks about his house. Now, sometimes we look at this and we think, okay, the problem was there was churches being turned into a marketplace, and maybe that was the problem. That this money changers and bird sellers and some of the other accounts, it's not just birds, but sheep and other animals for sacrifice. Looking at this, I'm not so sure that there was actually a problem with money changing and selling birds and sheep. Those things weren't wrong. They were practical considerations that were not only acceptable, but were necessary. See, people came from all over to the temple to bring their sacrifices, but they didn't bring all that stuff with them. They brought currency from wherever they came from, their place of origin. They're going to have to change their money and then purchase these animals for sacrifice. And so the money changers and the bird sellers were actually doing a vital service. So it's not the problem that was happening. The problem is where it was happening. And the problem was that it was taking space that should have been for something else. And so there are three adjustments Jesus makes in terms of refocusing, redefining, repositioning what church should be. 3 moves, if you will. The first one is a move from temple to house. Think about that for a moment. 3 times it says the temple. He came into the temple. He spoke in the temple. He said you cannot take things through the temple. And so we see this temple, but then when Jesus spoke about his kingdom, his church, he didn't say, okay, we're in the temple and I'm going to correct something about the temple. So my temple compared to this temple is like this. No, he said my house. And the move is when we think about the church, we think about the purpose of God, the people of God, our mentality is to shift from temple to house. What does that mean? Temple is a place we visit. A house is a place we live. A temple is a place of ritual. A house is a place of relationship, family. There's a different mentality in house. And so Jesus didn't, in order to describe what was wrong in the temple, he had to change the metaphor, change the idea. And so when we think about church, it's about people. It's about relationships. It's about house. It's about home. It's about family. That's what we're after. That's a shift Jesus is making. Secondly, it was a move from practical to spiritual. I mentioned earlier that the practical need of money changing and selling doves, pigeons here, other of the gospel writers add sheep to the mix, of changing money to purchase these for sacrifice. Those were not bad things. They were not wrong things. They were practical things. But the idea of moving from practical to spiritual is telling us when the practical dominates the spiritual, when the practical becomes the point, when the administrative becomes more important than the ministry, when the things being in order, it's more important than the moving of the Spirit or the people of God, something's wrong. And see, this practical, as important as those things were and as necessary as they were out of order. And that's part of what Jesus is correcting, is that practical is supposed to serve the spiritual, not lead the spiritual, not dominate the spiritual, not override and overrule the spiritual. And that happens. It is so easy for that to happen in ministry, in church, in worship, in whatever we're doing in discipleship. The form is important, but the power is the point. Sometimes we hold to a form, but we've denied the power, and we need to see the power, the presence, the spirit flow. And the practical helps that and serves that, but it was out of order here. Now, the third move, if we're talking about a move from the temple to the house, from the practical to the spiritual, not either or, but what is more important. And then the final one is from local to global. He says this, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. So many people are concerned about their nation with no concern about all nations. And this is a shift from local to global. It's not either or, but a priority. It's not just us and no one else, but it's us plus. And so what he's saying here, a house of prayer for all nations. Yes, it's fine to pray for your local community. It's important to pray for your local community. It's important to pray for the people who are members of this temple, this house, this spiritual community. But it's not just that. If it ends there, something's wrong. And so Jesus is making adjustment to the way the church functions and the way that we're supposed to think about the church, that it's not just your nation, but it's all nations. It's not just local, but it's local to global. I think about this being a house of prayer for all nations. And we've said things like this in the Every Nation world, that we want to see every church as a mission base, every church as a mission sending church, every church as an apostolic center to reach your own Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Doesn't matter how large or small, how old or how new, how well-funded or how barely getting by. None of those things are things we should wait for before we start thinking local to global. You've all heard the story when my wife and I first landed in the Philippines, and 2 weeks in, we got our first semi-permanent 2-year-long church building lease. First thing we did, we stuck a National Geographic world map on the wall. Most people went down those basement stairs, going to worship every Sunday. There was a world map. And right on top of the world map We hand wrote on an index card, Psalm 2:8, ask of me and I'll give the nations as your inheritance. And we told people, when you come to church, first thing you do is you lay hands on the map and you ask God for the nations. We were a 2-week-old church, 3-week-old church, 3-month-old church. We were a church filled with students, with just students and no one else. There were no resources. There were no opportunities. There was no reason why we should have ever been able to impact the nations. But from the very beginning, when our church was the smallest that it ever was, when we had less money than we ever had as a church community, when we had no influence and we were a bunch of kids with nothing but a vision and a dream, from the very beginning, we decided we will be a house of prayer for all nations. And the first move at the beginning of every call to worship and the beginning of every worship service for us, the church I pastored, was to pray for the nations. In the next 4 decades, we sent missionaries to multiple nations and actually sent missionaries from our church to plant churches in over 30 nations. The house of prayer for all nations. It's never too early to start being that. You're never too small to be that. You're never too underfinanced to be a house of prayer for all nations. And as you become a house of prayer for all nations, you'll become a mission sending force to all nations. I hope that you never experience Jesus rearranging the furniture and the schedule and the priorities of your church the way we read about it in this text. The way to avoid that is let's just be a house of prayer for all nations. Let's be concerned not just locally, but globally. Let's be the kind of church that prays for the nations. And as a result of that, we go to the nations. I believe not only will that result in great advancements in world mission, or more than anything, I believe when we become a house of prayer for all nations, we will honor God and we will please our Father.